What if I told you that the most important part of Jesus' life was erased? That right after the resurrection, when everything should have been revealed, the story simply stops. Not by chance, not due to lack of information, but because someone chose to silence it. The question is, why? For centuries, we were taught that Jesus rose, appeared to a few disciples, and ascended into heaven. End of story. But the apocryphal Gospels, ancient manuscripts and forgotten testimonies tell a different version. One the church avoided, one that reveals that Jesus continued his mission, spoke to others, traveled, and taught secrets that could change Christianity forever. This is not a typical video. What you're about to hear is not preached in churches or found in catechisms. We're going to dig deep into the hidden history of Jesus after the cross, a stage silenced by fear, by power, or by a truth that could still shake the foundations of many beliefs. Prepare yourself, because this journey won't just question what you've always believed. It will offer answers your soul has been longing for. And if you stay until the end, you'll understand why the silence of those days was the Vatican's most powerful strategy. Before we begin, I ask you something important. Over 80% of the people who watch our videos are still not subscribed. If you believe we deserve to know the truth, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay with me until the end. Today, you're going to discover what no one dared to say about Jesus after the cross. The New Testament dedicates entire chapters to the passion, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. But once his victory over death is proclaimed, something strange happens. The narrative suddenly becomes vague. The Bible tells us that Jesus remained on earth for 40 days after rising from the dead, Acts 1:3. But only a handful of encounters are recorded. What did he do during the rest of that time? Where was he? Who did he speak with? This narrative void is not a mistake. It's an uncomfortable silence. A silence that screams, that hints, that hides. A silence that invites the spiritual seeker to look beyond the official texts and ask, why was such a crucial part left out? Just imagine the impact it would have if we knew that Jesus kept teaching, walking, and transforming lives after the cross. Why wasn't every step of that journey carefully documented? Some scholars suggest that early church leaders deliberately chose what should be preserved and what should be forgotten, not necessarily out of malice, but for control, structure, convenience. Because if Jesus spoke new truths after his resurrection, those teachings could have disrupted the entire system they were trying to build. The silence following the resurrection is, in itself, a call to seek. The first Christians didn't have a closed, definitive Bible. They lived their faith through letters, oral testimonies, and sacred texts, many of which are still being discovered in caves, ruins, and sealed archives. What if those texts contained the continuation of the story? What if Jesus's true final message is one we still haven't heard? We're not talking about baseless theories, but a historical pattern. Since the early councils, the church decided what was official and what had to be eliminated or ignored. That biblical silence after the resurrection may be one of the most fertile grounds for spiritual truth, because sometimes what isn't said speaks louder than what is. And it's precisely in that void that the deepest questions arise. Could Jesus have left instructions we never received? Could his mission have only just begun after the cross? The lack of clear answers shouldn't weaken your faith. It should drive it forward. Because the greatest spiritual discoveries are not born from certainty, but from courageous questions. After his resurrection, Jesus didn't return to public life as a triumphant leader surrounded by crowds. No, he chose to appear quietly, on deserted roads, in closed homes, in intimate moments. Why so much discretion? Why didn't he make a glorious entrance into Jerusalem for all to see that he had conquered death? The answer may lie in the hidden purpose behind those appearances. They weren't meant to prove anything, but to reveal deep truths to those who had ears to hear. And the most surprising part is that not all of these encounters are in the Bible. Some were recorded in apocryphal texts, others were passed down orally and eventually forgotten or rejected by official tradition. A key example is the story of Cleopas and another disciple on the road to Emmaus, Luke 24. Jesus walks with them, speaks with them, yet their eyes are veiled. They don't recognize him until he breaks bread. What does this mystery symbolize? That Jesus was no longer bound by flesh or human perception. He revealed himself only to those spiritually prepared to see him. How many other appearances like this were never recorded? How many people saw him, yet their testimonies were discarded for not fitting the dominant narrative? The canonical Gospels mention that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, 1 Corinthians 15:6, but we don't know who they were. We don't know what they said. We don't know what they learned. Why isn't that staggering number accompanied by detail? What was taught in those encounters? What secrets did Jesus share with those who weren't part of the 12? These questions have haunted theologians, mystics, and seekers for centuries. Because if Jesus spoke, walked, and touched so many people, why do we know so little? Some ancient texts, like the Gospel of Mary or the Acts of Peter, describe appearances that reveal a more spiritual Jesus, free, luminous, speaking of the soul's mysteries of the inner kingdom, of truths that challenged the religious leaders of his time. Appearances in caves, deserts, visions, all of it labeled as heresy for not conforming to ecclesiastical tradition. But to those who seek a deeper connection with Christ, these accounts sound more like revelation than fiction. The Church chose what to remember, but the forgotten testimonies still echo in the hearts of those who feel Jesus is alive, not just in doctrine, but in spirit. Perhaps these mysterious appearances weren't isolated events, but part of a secret mission to plant divine knowledge in the hearts of the willing. And if that's true, then there is still much left to discover. While most Christians rely on the four Gospels, officially accepted into the biblical canon, there are other texts, just as ancient and deeply spiritual, that describe details the Vatican chose to leave out. These are the so-called apocryphal Gospels, not because they are false, but because they were deemed inconvenient for the doctrinal structure being built at the time. And it is precisely in these writings that we find unsettling clues about what Jesus may have done after his resurrection. One of the most striking is the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Although it doesn't describe events, many of these sayings carry a tone that is mystical, profound, as if spoken during the final stage of his earthly life. Another revealing text is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, where she appears not only as a witness of the resurrection, but as the recipient of spiritual revelations that the other disciples neither understood nor accepted. Why were these texts suppressed? What truths did they carry that seemed so dangerous? The apocryphal writings portray a Jesus who didn't simply return to comfort his disciples, but came back to prepare a few of them for something far greater. Some accounts speak of secret teachings, celestial visions, mysteries about the soul, the afterlife, and the inner kingdom of God. These themes deviate from the institutionalized Jesus and draw us closer to a universal teacher, free, deeply divine, yet profoundly human. And that terrified those who wanted to build a religion based on hierarchy, rules, and control. One of the most silenced texts is the Gospel of Philip, which speaks of an intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, of a spiritual knowledge passed down only to those worthy of understanding it. It even describes the resurrection not as something purely physical, but as a symbolic transformation, as if Jesus wanted his followers to transcend the flesh to understand the spirit. This kind of language didn't fit the literalist, power-focused church, so it was buried. But truth doesn't die. It only waits to be rediscovered. Today, thanks to discoveries like the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, we now have access to many of these hidden Gospels. And while some continue to deny them, their existence is undeniable. They are there, challenging the official version, inviting us to see Jesus from another perspective, not as a figure behind an altar, but as a revealer of eternal truths. And if those truths were spoken after the cross, maybe it's time we listen, truly listen, with awakened hearts. One of the most enigmatic scenes in the New Testament takes place in an unexpected setting, the road to Emmaus. Two disciples, overwhelmed with grief, walk aimlessly after the death of their master. Suddenly, a stranger joins them. He speaks to them, explains the scriptures, opens the eyes of their hearts, but they don't recognize him. Only when he breaks the bread do they finally see. It was Jesus. Luke 24:13-35. This brief moment holds one of the deepest secrets of Christian faith. Jesus was still present, still teaching, still guiding, but not in the same way. This passage suggests that after the cross, Jesus didn't seek spectacle or public recognition. On the contrary, he chose what was intimate, discreet, personal. He didn't reveal himself in the temple or in crowded plazas. He appeared while walking, eating, talking with those whose hearts were broken. This shows us that his mission didn't end at the cross, nor even with the resurrection. He continued forming disciples, but from a new dimension, one that was deeper, more spiritual. How many other roads like Emmaus did Jesus walk without us ever knowing? The fact that the disciples didn't recognize him right away is also deeply symbolic. Jesus had changed. He was no longer bound by matter or human expectations. Only those with open hearts could see him. The act of breaking bread, so simple, so ordinary, became a divine revelation. What other conversations did Jesus have during those days? What truths did he share that were never written down? Who else saw him and heard him, but was deemed not official enough to be included in Scripture? What happened on the road to Emmaus was not just an appearance, it was a declaration. Jesus was alive, yes, but he was operating in a different way. His message continued, not from a pulpit, but from personal experience. He became mystery, presence, intimate revelation. And this changes everything about religion. It's not about finding Jesus in dogma, but in everyday life, in honest conversations, in the simplicity of a meal. Perhaps that's what he taught during those 40 days, and that's why it was forgotten. If the institutional church aimed to build structures of power, this free, wandering, deeply human Jesus posed a threat. He didn't need temples or hierarchies to transform lives. All it took was to walk with him, even if you didn't recognize him at first. And maybe that same Jesus still walks beside us today, waiting to be seen when he breaks the bread with us. Among all the figures in the New Testament, few have been as misunderstood, silenced, or diminished as Mary Magdalene. Despite being the first to see the risen Jesus, her role was minimized for centuries. But why? Why did the church choose to portray her as a redeemed sinner instead of recognizing her as an intimate disciple, a privileged witness, the bearer of secrets even the apostles couldn't grasp? Her encounter with Jesus after the cross wasn't just another appearance. It was a choice. Jesus chose her to see him first, and that changes everything. According to the Gospel of John 20:11-18, Mary is the one who stays near the tomb weeping after everyone else had left. It's in that moment, in the intimacy of her grief, that Jesus appears to her. She doesn't recognize him at first. She mistakes him for a gardener. But when he says her name, something awakens. Her spiritual eyes are opened. That detail is powerful. It wasn't his image or surroundings, it was the personal connection, soul recognizing soul. And in that sacred moment, Jesus entrusts her with the mission of announcing his resurrection. She becomes the apostle to the apostles. But her story doesn't end there. In texts like the Gospel of Mary, she receives profound teachings about the soul, sin, and the true kingdom of God. Peter even questions her, not because of what she says, but because she's a woman. And there lies one of the core conflicts in Christian history, the tension between free spiritual knowledge and a patriarchal religious structure. Mary represented direct access to Jesus, no intermediaries, no hierarchies. That's why her voice was silenced. The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene has been the subject of theories, distortions, and manipulations. But one thing is certain: she held a unique place in the heart of the Master. It wasn't about romance, it was about spiritual trust. Jesus entrusted her with truths others weren't ready to receive, and in doing so, he left us a message. Divine knowledge is not reserved for religious elites. It's given to hearts that are open, regardless of gender or role. Today, recovering her story is not just about vindicating a forgotten woman. It's about reclaiming a vital part of Jesus' message after the cross. A message of intimacy, of direct revelation, of a faith lived without filters. Mary Magdalene was not a supporting character. She was a witness, a confidant, and a carrier of a truth that still echoes. The risen Christ continues to choose hearts that love beyond fear. What if Jesus didn't just appear to his disciples after the resurrection, but actually traveled to distant lands? What if the 40 days mentioned in the Bible were only a small portion of a much larger mission, one that was deliberately hidden for centuries? There are ancient legends, controversial documents, and age-old traditions that claim Jesus may have visited places like India, Tibet, Egypt, and even parts of Europe. These theories, though rejected by official history, still live on in communities that believe they received his teachings directly. But what if they're true? In India, certain Buddhist texts mention a holy man who came from the West, who taught in parables and healed with his hands. They called him Isa. This name appears in ancient manuscripts discovered at the Hemis monastery in Ladakh, where it said this Isa lived and preached among Eastern sages. Was it Jesus? The parallels are astonishing: humility, compassion, miracles, persecution by religious authorities. And the most intriguing part? These accounts speak of both his youth and his return after the crucifixion. In Egypt, a land deeply intertwined with Israel's spiritual history, Coptic traditions suggest that Jesus may have returned there to share esoteric teachings with small groups of initiates. And in France, ancient legends tell of Mary Magdalene arriving by sea, accompanied by other disciples, and that she wasn't alone. Some versions even suggest Jesus himself was there, living in secret, sharing his message quietly. Could this all be collective fantasy? Or is there a buried truth no one dares to unearth? Those who support these theories aren't trying to attack the faith. On the contrary, they seek to expand it. Because if Jesus truly traveled after the cross, it would change the idea of a faith locked inside Jerusalem. It would mean that the risen Christ wasn't limited to one people or culture, but became a universal teacher, bringing his light to distant corners of the earth. Maybe the message wasn't hidden, just scattered, fragmented, spread along paths we've yet to rediscover. These possibilities, while controversial, awaken a legitimate spiritual thirst. They invite us to seek Jesus beyond the altar, beyond dogma, beyond borders. If his love knows no limits, why would his presence after the resurrection be confined? Perhaps the real mystery isn't whether he traveled or not, but why they stopped telling the story. If ancient documents, strong traditions, and apocryphal texts suggest that Jesus continued his mission after the cross, then why has the church chosen to remain silent? Why isn't any of this taught in sermons, catechism, or theological seminars? The answer may be deeper than it appears. Accepting the possibility that Jesus continued teaching, traveling, and revealing new truths outside the traditional apostolic structure would directly threaten the model of religious authority that's been built over centuries. Since the early councils, like the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Church has worked carefully to construct a unified, controlled narrative with clearly defined dogmas. Everything that didn't fit into that framework, apocryphal gospels, uncomfortable stories, central female figures, unauthorized appearances, was labeled heresy. Why? For control. Because a faith grounded in personal experience with the risen Christ does not need structures, hierarchies, or intermediaries, and that makes power nervous. To acknowledge that Jesus may have continued teaching, moving, or revealing new spiritual knowledge after the resurrection would reopen a debate the Church closed long ago. It would call into question the idea of an untouchable canon. It would force us to examine the selection process behind today's Bible. Why were certain texts chosen and others discarded? What was lost in that process? The institutional silence around these questions is no accident, it's self-preservation. Moreover, to speak of a post-resurrection Jesus who breaks from the traditional mold, dismantles the image of Christ as solely divine, and places him closer to us, human, intimate, free. Not a figure who ascended and vanished, but one who kept walking among his own, teaching freely, entrusting his secrets to those with open hearts. That image, though powerful, is not easily manipulated. And perhaps that's why it was softened, edited, or erased. But times are changing. More and more people are daring to seek truth for themselves, to read forgotten texts, to question what was imposed without explanation. This search is not rebellion against faith. It's a hunger for something real, alive, and authentic. And in that deep longing, the figure of Jesus after the cross rises again. This time, not as dogma, but as a living symbol of a spirituality that refuses to be caged. The Vatican's silence doesn't deny the truth, it only delays it. And the more it is silenced, the louder the question echoes in the hearts of the sincere. What else have they hidden? Because maybe it's not about tearing down the Church, but about returning to the Jesus who walked among us, even after the resurrection. When we think of Jesus after the cross, we usually imagine a glorified figure who simply ascended to heaven and vanished from earthly history. But what if the most revealing phase of his mission actually came after the resurrection? What if this silent, hidden, wandering, deeply spiritual Jesus still has more to teach us than the institutional version we've been shown for centuries? This possibility doesn't just reshape history, it reshapes faith itself. The Jesus who appears in non-canonical texts, alternative testimonies, and forgotten traditions is a Jesus who feels closer, freer, more human. He's not bound to temples or rituals. He doesn't preach to crowds. He doesn't seek power. He teaches through silence, through eye contact, through intimacy. He reveals himself to those who doubt, walks with the brokenhearted, speaks to souls in anguish. Isn't that the Jesus we need most today? A Christ who doesn't impose, but accompanies, who doesn't punish, but transforms, who doesn't demand, but inspires. And it is precisely this Jesus, the one who doesn't fit into man-made molds, who can open the door to a deeper, more personal faith. Not a faith of habit, fear, or empty tradition, but a living faith. A faith embodied in everyday life. The unknown Jesus invites us to stop looking for him in the usual places and to start finding him where he truly dwells, in the inner experience, in awakened conscience, in unconditional love. Religious leaders have feared for centuries that this kind of spirituality might undermine their institutions. But what many fail to understand is that deeper faith doesn't destroy structure. It purifies it. It doesn't reject everything. It transcends what is superficial. And when you dare to look at the post-crucifixion Jesus with new eyes, you discover that his message didn't end with the resurrection. It became more powerful, more complete, more eternal. Maybe the true miracle wasn't that Jesus defeated death, but that his message kept growing even when he was no longer physically present. And if that message was silenced, forgotten, or hidden, then maybe now is the time to bring it back. Because there are truths that never die. They simply wait for someone courageous enough to listen with an open heart. Imagine just for a moment that everything you've heard so far is true. That Jesus truly continued his mission after the cross. That he spoke with disciples outside the circle of the 12. That he traveled beyond Jerusalem. That he revealed spiritual secrets never taught from a pulpit. What would that change in your life? How would it affect your view of faith, the church, salvation, your relationship with God? This isn't just about ancient history. This is about you, here and now. If Jesus wasn't limited by death, then why would we confine him to a closed book or a rigid doctrine? If his love transcended the cross, then his message is still alive today, active, waiting to be discovered beyond the religious mold. The idea that these truths were hidden shouldn't lead to anger or despair, but to hunger. Hunger for more. Hunger to go deeper. Hunger to move beyond everything we've been told. Because maybe, in that hunger, lies the beginning of true faith. It's not easy to question what you were taught since childhood. Many fear that opening certain doors might cause everything to collapse. But the truth is, the beliefs that survive are the ones that can be questioned and still stand. And if the post-resurrection Jesus has endured in hidden manuscripts, in marginal stories, in the hearts of those who seek, maybe it's because God himself wanted that message to be protected until the right moment. This isn't a call to abandon your faith. It's a call to rediscover it, to brush off the dust of the centuries, to see with new eyes the same Christ who touched lepers, wept with his friends, and broke every rule for the sake of love. Because if Jesus is still speaking, even from within the silence of history, the real sin would be to ignore him. Maybe deep down you've felt it all along, that something was missing in what you were taught. Maybe this is the missing piece. Maybe today, for the first time, you're seeing Jesus not as they portrayed him, but as he truly is, alive, free, eternal, and still willing to reveal himself to anyone brave enough to seek him. Most people simply assume that after the ascension, Jesus went to heaven and has remained there until the end of time. But what does that really mean? Where is heaven? What happens to the consciousness of the risen Christ beyond the physical realm? And why is this final, transcendent moment wrapped in so much mystery and so little explanation? If every stage of Jesus' life was filled with meaning and revelation, why would his departure be reduced to a farewell? Acts 1:9 tells us that a cloud hid him from their sight. It doesn't say he disappeared. It says he was hidden. Hidden from whom and why? Some mystics interpret that cloud as a symbol, a spiritual veil separating our limited perception from a higher dimension where Jesus still lives, still acts, still guides, but in a different form. He didn't cease to exist. He changed his state. Perhaps he never left. He simply moved to a space where we must learn to seek him with the soul. There are non-canonical accounts suggesting that Jesus continued to reveal himself even after the ascension, not as a physical body, but as an active spiritual presence, through visions, dreams, private appearances. The official story silenced these manifestations, deeming them dangerous to the established order. But countless humble souls claim to have heard his voice, felt his guidance, received his comfort. And what if the post-ascension Jesus isn't the end, but the beginning of a new kind of relationship? Maybe the real question isn't, where is he? But why can't we hear him? Maybe instead of waiting for him to return in the way we imagine, we should learn to recognize him now, in the whispers of the Spirit, in a transformed conscience, in everyday miracles. The living Christ is not absent. He's hidden deep within the human heart, waiting to be discovered by those who truly love him. And perhaps That was his plan all along, not to abandon us, but to teach us how to find him from within, beyond flesh, beyond temple, beyond time. Because if there's one thing this entire journey has made clear, it's that Jesus never stopped walking among us. He only stopped doing it the way we expected. Now that you know what was silenced, what was buried, what was labeled dangerous by those who sought to shape faith to their own convenience, the question becomes unavoidable. What will you do with this truth? Because this is not just about historical facts or alternative theories. This is a profound spiritual revelation, one that could shake your relationship with God and elevate it to a whole new level of intimacy. Jesus was not limited by the cross. He wasn't confined by the tomb, and he can never be reduced to a dead doctrine. He is alive, not as a distant figure, but as an active guide for all who dare to seek beyond what is permitted. The Jesus who walked after the resurrection, who spoke on forgotten roads, who entrusted his secrets to the unseen and the unimportant, is the same Jesus who now stands at your door. Maybe the institutional church chose not to tell this part of the story, but that doesn't mean you should ignore it. What you've heard today is not fiction, it's an invitation to think, to feel, to connect with eternity from within. Because if Jesus truly continued his mission after the cross, then the story isn't over. It continues, and you are part of it. So now I ask you, do you believe that Jesus is still walking among us? Have you ever felt him close, even when no one else did? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think, what you believe, what you've experienced, and if this message touched your spirit, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and don't miss the next videos, because what's coming will uncover even more secrets that have been hidden for centuries. Share this video with someone who also deserves to know this truth.